There are moments in a man's life when certain behaviors become almost irresistibly seductive, not because they are thrilling, but because they offer the illusion of being the only exit in the middle of chaos. They don't begin with a roar, but with a sigh. Soft, subtle, almost invisible. Often, they emerge as harmless attempts to escape the dull ache of discomfort, the shapeless weight of some unnameable emptiness. But over time, these seemingly temporary choices harden into habits. And habits, when repeated long enough, ossify into unconscious mechanisms, closed circuits, where a man returns again and again to the same act, not out of hope, but because he no longer sees anything else to reach for. The search for a fleeting moment of relief, a flash of peace, gradually becomes a draining ritual. A ritual of self-soothing, quiet, exhausted, and eventually, what once served as a temporary escape becomes a spiritual shackle. It doesn't scream, it doesn't sting. It simply, silently, drains the life from within. But what lies behind this cycle? What compels a man to continue seeking something he already knows is harming him? The truth, harsh and unflattering, is that these behaviors are often echoes of a deeper wound, a tear in the soul that was never stitched shut. It's not simply about chasing pleasure or relief. It is a desperate attempt to reconnect with the part of oneself that has long been exiled. The addict does not act out of lust for sensation, he acts out of a sacred hunger. A hunger not of the flesh, but of meaning. Even when the behavior appears self-destructive, at the core, it is still a search for something that might fill the shapeless, nameless, borderless void. Have you ever wondered why some men are devoured completely by addiction, seemingly swallowed whole, while others walk away from it as if it never had claws? Addiction is one of the most intricate and daunting labyrinths of the human psyche. It is not merely a behavioral issue, nor is it simply a matter of weak will. It is an ecosystem of unspoken desires, suppressed pain, and suffocated dreams. In the modern world, addiction is not limited to substances. It wears many masks. Phones, work, sex, social media, achievement. But behind all of them stands one unchanging reality: a thirst for existence, a craving to feel real again. This is where most of society gets it wrong. Addiction doesn't arise from moral decay. It arises from unheard pain. And if we look long enough and honestly enough, we may come to see that even those of us who claim not to be addicted in the classical sense may still be carrying more subtle addictions, ones that hide in ritual, routine, and repetition. Habits we perform not because they matter, but simply to avoid being left alone with ourselves. In this light, a new kind of seeing is required. Not one of condemnation, but of courage. Not just empathy, but existential strength. And that is why Carl Jung and Gabor Maté have become two essential pillars in the modern understanding of addiction, not as judges, but as guides through the dark forest of the soul. Jung never looked at the addict as a degenerate. He did not see them as moral failures, but as souls thrown out of balance. To him, addiction was not a flaw of character, but the visible symptom of an inner world in crisis. Addiction, in Jung's eyes, is a form of escape, a flight from pain, a flight from the question, who am I? A question that no one ever taught us how to confront. A retreat from the existential void, the emptiness that modern society knows only how to cover with products, job titles, and consumption. When man cannot look inward, he begins to seek salvation outside. And so, he turns to addiction not because it brings happiness, but because it allows him, however briefly, to forget that he is in pain. Gabor Maté, walking in Jung's footsteps with the compassionate lens of modern medicine, reframes the question of addiction. He does not ask, "What's wrong with you?" He asks, "What happened to you?" This is not a semantic shift. It is a shift in soul. From judgment to understanding. From condemnation to restoration. Both Maté and Jung agree, addiction is a symptom. And no symptom can be defeated with moralism or dry discipline. It must be transformed. And that transformation begins not with control, but with confrontation. not with willpower, but with the willingness to turn toward the shadow one has spent a lifetime trying to bury. Healing, then, does not begin with abstinence. It begins with listening. Listening to what within you has been neglected, to what has been pushed aside, to the parts of you that were never touched with presence, never embraced without judgment. Addiction is not simply a harmful habit. It is an unconscious effort to fill an interior void, a void that has no clear shape, but echoes softly beneath every behavior. That void may stem from many layers of silence, a loss of meaning, a disconnection from feeling, or the exile of parts of oneself that were never acknowledged, never welcomed, never integrated. Jung understood addiction as a form of withdrawal from reality, most often during periods of deep psychic crisis. Moments when the psyche is pressed too tightly by stress, confusion, or existential disorientation. In such moments, man does not retreat with silence. He retreats through repetition. Drinking, smoking, scrolling, playing, buying, watching, overworking. But this flight was never built to last. Everything we use to escape reality eventually throws us back into it. Only now it returns heavier, more bruised, more difficult to face. And so the loop begins. Addiction, escape, collapse, regret, return to addiction. A cycle that does not solve the root pain, but deepens it, poisons it, buries it. The farther you run, the more you forget the way back. And the more lost you become in the very thing you thought would save you. In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Gabor Maté writes, "False needs, no matter how often they are satisfied, can never make us feel truly full. The brain, in his words, never rests. It never says, enough. It cannot let go. It cannot redirect. It's like a man who has just finished a feast, but still feels hungry, and immediately begins to panic, looking for his next meal. But this hunger is not in the stomach. It is in the soul. A soul that has never been properly nourished will keep demanding endlessly, frantically through all the wrong forms. The addict does not truly want what he is doing. What he wants is for the aching void inside him to go silent. But because he cannot name it, he reaches for whatever is most convenient. And so he eats without hunger, buys without need, watches without comprehension, lives without presence." Gabor Maté defines addiction not as a dependence on substances alone, but as any behavior that a person feels compelled to repeat, regardless of the harm it causes to themselves or to others. This is why addiction is not just heroin, alcohol, or cigarettes. It is also social media, pornography, video games, work, the gym, body image obsession, sex, shopping, even the pursuit of success and motivation. Anything that begins as passion, if not governed by consciousness and presence, can slide silently into addiction. And so, the greatest question, as Maté suggests, is not, is this something I love? But rather, who is in control, you or the behavior? Can you stop? When you are fully aware of the harm it causes, can you truly let it go? If the answer is no, then what you're calling passion may have already become your shackles. Here, the difference between passion and addiction is not in intensity. It is in control. Passion is lived in freedom. Addiction lives in reflex. Passion is a fire you hold in your hand. Addiction is a fire that consumes you while convincing you it's light. If you cannot stop the behavior, if you cannot keep your own promise that, "This time I'll quit," then you are already inside addiction. Not because you are weak, but because something inside you has been abandoned for far too long. For decades, thinkers, psychologists, and sociologists have argued about the root of addiction. Some blame the addict, branding it a personal failure, a moral collapse. Others blame society, poverty, injustice, lack of opportunity. But neither view goes far enough. The truth lies deeper. And if you wish, I will take us there next. To the core hunger, to the place behind the fire, to the silence where addiction first begins to whisper. But there is a deeper and more accurate understanding of addiction that has been illuminated by modern analysts and researchers. Addiction is not simply something that lives inside a person. It is the result of an interaction between subject and object. In other words, addiction arises when a person frequently feels the need to alter his own state of being, when he seeks to escape himself and begins to rely on an object or behavior to generate that shift. An addiction forms when one's inner world becomes unbearable, and the outer world is used as a tool to soothe it. In her book Addiction by Design, Natasha Dow-Schüll shows us that addiction is not merely the fault of weak individuals, but also the result of certain external systems deliberately engineered to addict. Some substances, some platforms, some behaviors, through their neurological or structural properties, possess the power to alter human consciousness with such force that anyone already in pain is drawn into them almost helplessly. Put simply, we live in a world designed to exploit the vulnerabilities of the human psyche. In that world, the most susceptible are not the lazy or the weak, but the sensitive, those never shown how to navigate their depths, those not taught how to anchor themselves from within. And when such a soul encounters a highly addictive stimulus, be it alcohol, narcotics, social media, pornography, or even praise, their capacity for internal regulation collapses. Gabor Maté, after decades of working with the most severe addicts, affirms, all addiction, regardless of substance or severity, is a desperate attempt to find relief from suffering. And wherever there is addiction, there is pain. We tend to believe that addicts are chasing pleasure. The truth is, they're trying to escape pain. Every time they return to the substance, to the behavior, to the ritual, it is not because they enjoy it. It is because they no longer know how else to quiet the storm within. And that pain, as Maté reminds us, is never the same from one person to another, but it is always there. Some men turn to addiction as a way of self-medicating their depression, anxiety, or persistent inner turmoil. Others use it to forget the weight of an exhausting job or the pain of a relationship scarred by betrayal. Still, others are trying to escape something far darker, the existential black hole of a life without meaning. In one conversation, Gabor Maté spoke with a 47-year-old man who had been addicted to heroin since adolescence. Maté asked him, "Why are you still using?" And the man replied, "I don't know, I'm just trying to fill some kind of emptiness in my life. This deep boredom, this feeling of having no direction." That answer may sound simple, but within it lies one of the most brutal truths about the nature of addiction. It is not a question of willpower. It is a question of meaning. The emotional pain that most addicts are trying to outrun often has deep roots in the past, and in most cases, that past takes the shape of childhood. Decades of research affirm the vast majority of heavy substance users grew up in environments marked by violence, emotional neglect, or chaos. These childhood wounds do not merely live in memory. They etch themselves into the nervous system. They shape emotional reflexes, and they construct lifelong coping mechanisms. Carl Jung once wrote, "All the disorders of parenting leave clear imprints in the psyche of the child, sometimes with pathological results. The adult may suffer, but it is the inner child who becomes the addict. Addiction does not begin in adulthood. It begins in the crib." This is why the formative years of early development hold an immeasurable significance in determining a person's vulnerability to addiction later in life. Just as a fetus in the womb lives in absolute symbiosis with the mother's body, the infant in its earliest years exists in total psychological and emotional fusion with its caregivers. When the brain is still soft as clay, when self-regulation has not yet formed, the emotional presence, or absence, of the parent becomes the child's first neurological map for how to interpret the world, and ultimately, how to interpret himself. When a child's early world is shaped by anger, emotional coldness, or parental abuse, he learns a simple and devastating lesson. Emotions are dangerous. To survive, the child must suppress his feelings. He tightens the inner grip. He numbs. But in that very act of self-defense, the brain itself is reshaped. The regions responsible for emotional processing, the dopaminergic systems, the opioid receptors, the limbic network, Even the impulse control centers in the prefrontal cortex, they never develop properly. And one day, the child becomes a man, stepping into the world with a nervous system wired for yearning, but incapable of soothing itself from within. So he looks outside, to pills, to liquor, to screens, to sex, to work, to anything that can temporarily drown out the quiet ache echoing inside. Gabor Maté notes, most severe addicts are not merely in pain. Their brains have been reshaped by childhood trauma. Their nervous systems have learned that the world is unsafe and that they themselves are unworthy of love unless they do something to earn it. But trauma does not always arrive with noise. It's not only abuse, abandonment, or orphanhood that scars the soul. Even emotional absence, when parents are physically present but emotionally vacant, can leave the same gaping hole. Psychologists call this silent separation. As Alan Shore describes it, parents can be present, provide food and shelter, but never truly show up in the gaze, in the heartbeat, in emotional attunement. The child, in such a home, feels the disconnection but doesn't know why. And in the absence of emotional response, he turns inward to self-soothe. He rocks. He sucks his thumb. He bites his nails. He shuts down. He learns to dissociate to stop feeling so that he can keep functioning. But those strategies, so essential for survival in childhood, become shackles in adulthood. Today's grown man may look strong, successful, charming, but somewhere inside, there is still a child who was never truly seen. And it is that child, that unseen part, who becomes the addict. They search for comfort in everything, but only to replace the one thing they never had enough of: a gaze that truly listens, an embrace without judgment, a presence truly present. And yet, the story does not end in childhood. Because in today's age, even those who grew up in emotionally rich, caring households are no longer immune to addiction. We are living in a time of collective spiritual crisis. A society not unlike Rome before its fall, where the masses ran to pleasure in order to forget the rot. We no longer become addicted because we were neglected. We become addicted because we are drowning in panic. We use addiction as a form of self-healing against the quiet, creeping despair called modernity. Gabor Maté says it clearly: unconscious obedience to a dehumanizing society is itself a form of collective addiction. In a world where people must twist and contort themselves to meet false ideals, where success is measured by speed and consumption, addiction becomes the soul's rebellion. It cannot take it anymore. And it screams through every compulsive act, I don't want to live like this. I cannot keep going like this. So the question is no longer, how do we quit? But rather, how do we return to ourselves long enough to no longer need the addiction? When society commands us to live as consumers, when we use technology, social media, and entertainment compulsively to escape helplessness and inner void, the result is inevitable. A perfect storm we now call the addiction crisis. And in this storm, we do not see only the addicts. We begin to see ourselves in degrees. Maté names it with brutal clarity. A fundamental emptiness permeates our entire culture. The addict is simply the one most aware of it. And it's true. The addict is not separate from society. He is simply the one whose defenses collapsed first. He knows there is a black hole inside him, and he is looking for something to fill it. The rest of us, we still go about our lives, but we circle that same hole, pretending it isn't there. We often say, I'm not addicted to anything. But ask yourself, every time you feel sadness, do you reach for your phone? Every time you feel lonely, do you buy something? Every time you're tired, do you find silence unbearable? Perhaps you are not addicted to a substance, but you may be addicted to distraction. Addicted to escaping yourself even for a moment. Addicted to the brief relief of forgetting. And the most tragic part is this: society doesn't heal that addiction. It normalizes it, even celebrates it. We live in a culture obsessed with consumption, action, and appearance. A culture that cannot touch the soul and therefore only deepens the chasm inside each person. And that void cannot be filled with possessions, attention, or achievement. It can only be filled with something eternal, something our modern world has forgotten, a sense of the soul. Gabor Maté puts it plainly. We have lost connection with our soul and spirit, the sources of meaning and value that do not depend on external conditions and cannot be taken from us. And once that connection is lost, we become vulnerable, easily seduced, easily sold. Add to all this the millions of people who grew up in distorted homes, homes marked by abuse or by emotional absence. Add to that a decaying society where trust has been replaced by marketing, where moral values have been diluted by profit, where depth is ridiculed for being inefficient. And the result? People flock to addiction as a mode of existence, not because they are stupid, not because they don't understand, but because they are trying to survive in the only way they know how. As Gabor Maté emphasizes, this behavior is neither entirely irrational nor entirely useless. In fact, addictive behaviors are remarkably effective, at least in the short term. They do numb the pain. They do soothe the wound temporarily. They make life briefly more bearable. One addict once told Maté, "I take drugs because I don't want to feel what I feel when I'm sober." That is not indulgence. That is a shattered confession, a declaration that their inner world has become unlivable. And so, addiction is no longer just a pursuit of pleasure. It becomes a flight from emotion, not only from pain, but from numbness, monotony, meaninglessness, and the sheer dull ache of a life stripped of depth. We drink, we scroll, we click, we consume, not always because we are in pain, but because we've stopped feeling anything at all. And in that numbness, addiction becomes a way to feel alive, even if just for a moment. In the dull suffering of daily life, the gray grind of work, obligations, silent loneliness, and emotional stagnation, the human spirit is worn down, hollowed out. And in that moment, what the addict craves is not success, not money, but something sacred, something that touches the deepest part of existence. This is why addiction, despite its pain, sometimes carries the illusion of transcendence, a fleeting false ecstasy that tricks the addict into believing they have touched the divine. William James, the early 20th century philosopher and psychologist, wrote about this with startling compassion. He described the effect of alcohol not only as a sedative for spiritual tension, but as something that could induce a state resembling mystical experience, at least in the early stages, before the substance begins its slow destruction of mind and body. In his classic work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, William James wrote, "The power of alcohol over mankind is unquestionably connected to the deepest and most tragic depths of life. For those flashes, those glimpses of something instantly recognized as sacred, are granted to many people in the vague early moments of a process that will later end in collapse and depravity." James was not praising alcohol. He was stripping bare a brutal truth, that addiction is not always a pursuit of pain relief. Often, it is a longing to touch beauty, a beauty no longer found in the sterile sobriety of modern life. In its early stages, addiction acts like a shortcut, a rapid access to pleasure, calm, even a surge of existential vitality. But like all shortcuts, it comes at a cost. And this cost is not paid all at once. It comes in subtle waves, the dulling of emotion, the hardening of the nervous system, and the slow decay of the brain's ability to feel natural joy. We think we're enjoying, but in truth, we are merely increasing the dose just to feel what once felt normal. This is the deadly spiral of addiction. Gradually, addictive behavior becomes the gravitational center of life. Everything else, health, relationships, creativity, purpose, recedes to the periphery. These once vital sources of fulfillment become faint echoes orbiting a black hole of compulsion. Biologically, addiction rewires the brain. It does not merely evoke emotion, it engraves new circuits. And once those pathways are forged, we lose volitional control. We see ourselves self-destruct. We know it's wrong, and yet we cannot stop. One part of the mind, still awake, watches the self unravel. But the part that governs behavior has been hijacked. This is inner paralysis, where consciousness becomes a spectator of its own collapse. Gabor Maté asks the central question: in such a state, can a person still be healed? Is there a way back? And his answer, grounded in honesty and hope, is yes, but it is not easy, because the very system that must heal the brain is the one that has been injured. The very function we need to recover, will, clarity, awareness, has been damaged. This is the tragedy of addiction. The internal operating system is corrupted, and no one else can reboot it for you. But, and this is vital, the human brain carries an astonishing capacity, neuroplasticity. No matter the age, no matter the damage, it can rebuild if we practice the right habits long enough. If we are patient, even in old age, Maté affirms, the brain can regenerate. And when the brain regenerates, will returns. And when will returns, the soul has a chance to rise from the pit it once fell into. Rewiring the brain is not only a biological act, it is a spiritual pilgrimage. For only when the nervous system is restructured can a man live, perhaps for the first time, a life that is whole, healthy, and truly free from addiction. This leads us to a profound idea, recognized by contemplative traditions and depth psychology alike: the concept of nodal consciousness. It is a form of awareness that transcends the binary game of pleasure versus pain, desire versus gratification, escape versus pursuit. It does not reject emotion, but allows us to experience the full spectrum of feeling with a rare and grounded equanimity. Not cold detachment, but an inner steadiness that does not flinch when the extremes of human experience pull in either direction. For Carl Jung, any path that leads us out of destructive repetition must begin with awareness. Without the inner gaze, there is no liberation. When a man fails to recognize the internal machinery driving his behaviors, when he remains unaware that his compulsions are the surface of a much deeper psychological current, then he will be ruled by them, cycling through the unconscious, without ever knowing why. Awareness, therefore, is the irreplaceable starting point for any real transformation. Not superficial awareness, like, I know I'm addicted, but a gaze that pierces to the root. I am not addicted because I am weak. I am addicted because I am hiding. I am using this behavior to cover something deeper, something I still lack the courage to name. Only when that is acknowledged can the process of healing truly begin. At first glance, this may sound simple, but in reality, many people remain trapped for years, even a lifetime, in a state of denial. They repeat destructive behaviors, justify them, comfort themselves with theories, but never once sit down and honestly ask, why am I doing this? When the addict finally sees their behavior as a temporary solution to a deeper pain, when they realize addiction is not the cause, but merely the symptom, then the path to recovery truly opens. From there, they must begin to reflect on the deeper structures of their life, the forces that brought them to the threshold of addiction. Jung always emphasized, the human soul is not a flat surface. It is a labyrinth layered and intricate, where memories, wounds, images, symbols, and inner conflicts weave together a vast and subtle architecture. Within that structure, addiction becomes a living symbol of something unintegrated. It is not the problem. It is a call that hasn't been heard. According to Jung, addiction is a symbolic behavior, the way a repressed part of the psyche struggles to survive. by any means necessary. It is how the unacknowledged soul bangs on the door, pounds the table, and screams, "I am here, look at me." And when a person begins to contemplate their addiction, not as shame, but as symbol, they are stepping into the process Jung called individuation, the journey back to wholeness. Individuation, the process of becoming a whole individual, is the integration of all fragmented parts of the soul, light and shadow, logic and instinct, consciousness and the unconscious,